Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, no one's been talking about the West this election. Now it has to change. We'll talk about Western interests with Brett Wilson and also shine a light on the Maverick Party.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. It is Friday, September 17th, just a few days left until the election, and then we go back to the normal content you've come to know and hopefully love here on the Andrew Lawton Show. Now, I have a feeling no matter what happens, we'll have a lot of material to get through in the months and perhaps years to come. As you know, I don't make predictions because that way it's impossible to be wrong. But when I have looked at the polls, one thing that's been fairly clear is that there hasn't been a lot of movement. Now, all of the polls have basically been saying the same thing, which is firstly that we're in minority government territory, and also that the Liberals and the Conservatives are expected to be fairly close. Now, the question about which one comes up on top, and in the case of a Conservative victory, whether that even means the chance to govern afterwards, still stands to be seen. But now the discussion has shifted, and the Conservative response to the PPC surge that we talked about in the previous episode is really coming down to, listen, the only way to defeat Justin Trudeau is to vote for the Conservatives. The Aaron O'Toole is saying he's the only guy that can beat Justin Trudeau, so if you don't want Justin Trudeau, no matter what, you've got to vote for him. That's the message from the Conservatives right now. The question there is whether that in and of itself is enough of a pitch to small c Conservative voters, but as we say, we shall certainly see. Last time I focused on the PPC, a couple of weeks ago, I put a bit of a spotlight on the Christian Heritage Party. We're not just about the major mainstream parties here. We want all of these alternative parties that are trying to offer something different in politics to have a voice. And with that, I want to turn to a different party this episode, but in the context of a different theme, and that is what this election means for the West. As you know, I am not a Westerner. I may have a Westerner sensibility about me, but I'm not from Alberta, although I have paid very close attention to the growing Western alienation problem because I realize that the West matters. Western industry matters, Western culture matters, Western voices matter. There's a reason that I've spoken at a few conferences in Alberta that have very specifically dealt with this issue because I'm on your side. I want the West and I want Alberta to be able to get fair deals with the government and with Confederation, and I realize that the status quo is not working. And a big part of that is because the mainstream media is dominated by people who have no Western connection. Politics tends to be dominated by non-Western voices, and as a result, you get this part of the country that is completely taken for granted. The Quebecers will cash the Alberta checks, the politicians will take the Alberta votes, but for the most part, nothing goes in return. And it's in that vein that I wanted to focus on the West this episode and what this election will mean for the West, and then also talk about one of the parties that's putting itself forward as an alternative to all of these Eastern-dominated parties, and that is the Maverick Party, led by former Conservative Minister and Member of Parliament Jay Hill. But before we get into that, I want to start big picture here. Let's talk to Brett Wilson. You may know him formerly as one of the stars of the show Dragon's Den, an investor, a venture capitalist. And he doesn't just play one on TV, he does that in real life. He's the head of the Prairie Merchant Corporation, and some of you may just know him as an absolute firebrand on Twitter. Doesn't shy away from telling people what he thinks, including Justin Trudeau. And Brett Wilson, I sat down with him in Calgary last week to talk about what this election means for the West. What are the stakes? This is our conversation. I mean, first and foremost here, business, generally speaking, is there to adapt. And, you know, you've had Liberal governments, Conservative governments, in Alberta provincially, NDP governments, Conservative governments. But I'm getting the sense from a lot of people that this is a particularly higher stakes election, certainly out West. And I'm just curious what your take on that is.
Well, let me roll the camera back for just a few moments. And that was to the day that Stephen Harper canceled income trusts. That was punitive to our industry, and they were working with bad information. So there I was, frustrated with the Conservatives. Don't get me wrong, very frustrated. But at least they respected the industry. They listened, they communicated, they engaged. And what we've seen under a Liberal federal government is no concern whatsoever. They bought a pipeline, but it was a pipeline that was necessary for Canadian infrastructure that wasn't going to get built. And so they knew it was necessary. Ultimately, I believe it'll be owned by Aboriginal or First Nations. But that's the one thing that they can say they've done, the Liberals can say they've done. But putting a cap on carbon tax or on emissions in the oil sands, trying to cap the oil sands growth, killing Gateway, not supporting Keystone XL in any way, shape, or form. And then Biden goes to Saudi Arabia and says, come on, we need some oil. Well, we're here waving our hands, except it's the West that's waving its hand. It's not the oil industry's proponent, which could be the federal Liberal government, who just didn't care. So no, the West is extraordinarily frustrated by the Liberal lack of concern for Confederation. That's the way I describe it. And West is part of Confederation. If they were concerned about every piece of Confederation, we would know about it, but they're not.
And when pipelines were brought up, just to look at the debates as one example, it was in a very ideological way, not about really the nuts and bolts of what this means for Canada's economy, what it means for the energy sector, and even a lot of the opposition we see to pipelines is not met with any proposal of, okay, well, what else? It's missing that, like you mentioned, Saudi Arabia is there to pick up whatever Canadian oil is not being sold.
Well, it's ludicrous that we're importing, let's call it close to 1 million barrels a day from other nations, and other nations who don't have the same respect for pollution, for rule of law, for, call it the environment, for women and children. So we're buying oil from countries that don't care. They're not paying a carbon tax in any way, shape, or form. They just don't care. So a third of our oil comes in without being tagged with any kind of carbon tax, and we don't make any of the the embedded profit that could be made. The capital that's invested, there's a return on capital, there's people, and I'm just talking about if we were producing incremental oil in the West, where we already have the oil, third largest oil reserves in the world, and this Energy East idea has been vetoed by, again, in Quebec, there was a leader who said, we don't do no pipelines. Well, what do you mean you don't do no pipelines? You're bringing it in by ship, which is effectively a pipeline from the other side of the world, and you don't care? And this is what's getting frustrating. And that's where my pitch is always, for Confederation to work, it has to be fair. And the Liberals don't care.
I know that at the provincial level, there's been a lot of talk about how Alberta specifically can sort of assert itself and get a better deal with Confederation. At the end of the day, though, Alberta can say whatever it wants. It needs a federal government that's going to be interested in that, and whether it's equalization or whether it's other things. And we see in politics a lot of the time Quebec being handed a particular deal that is not extended to any other province. It's not extended to the West. And when you talk to colleagues of yours in business here, what's the sense they have? Because we've seen oil and gas companies that have been leaving Alberta. Is that going to continue? Is that going to increase?
Well, I'm less concerned about the international companies that have left Canada because they've left the oil industry for us. Again, we have investors, we have people, we have businesses, Canadian Natural, Suncor, they grow, and I'm still involved with actively financing the growth of many juniors. So that's okay. But the frustration comes in the complete disregard for the importance of the oil industry to Canada. You know, the fact that we could have a pipeline, that we could be shipping oil, whether it's Gateway, Keystone XL, Energy East, those are all parts of participating in the global oil and gas industry. We ship coal to China. We don't attach a carbon tax. Again, we ship coal to China without a carbon tax, and they're still growing their carbon footprint, and there's not a peep. You don't hear it from the, again, name some names, Eco Justice, Sierra Club, none of them say a word. The National Resource Defense Council, all they want to do is attack Canada. And that's why I was a big fan of the work that Vivian Krause did, saying, hey, there's a lot of foreign influences interfering with the potential growth of the Canadian oil and gas industry. But going back, I don't see any support for the energy sector out of Seamus O'Regan. I've known Seamus for 20 years. I don't see any support in any way, shape, or forms from GM Butts. Jerry Butts is anti-oil and gas industry, and Trudeau has talked about capping it. All of those things undermine the West's interest in being part of Canada. And that's where if Trudeau got in with a majority government, I think you'll see the People's Party of Canada under Maxime grow, and you you would also see the Maverick Party gain strength that was unimagined. And I don't think anyone realizes the depth of support that would be available to the to the Maverick Party if Trudeau was back in power. Under O'Toole, I believe there'll be a negotiation, because without doubt, we're expecting a referendum this fall. I think the referendum question, as phrased by Kenny, is nothing short of brilliant, challenging how do we attack Confederation and the paperwork that's associated, because that's all it is. And separation doesn't involve digging a trench. Like, we're not physically leaving, but separation is a negotiating tool. And I'm not the first to want to be separated, but I'm the first to want a better deal. And I'm not seeing a better deal coming out of a Liberal relationship. I believe O'Toole would be the party that Kenny could work with and Alberta could work with. And don't forget, Saskatchewan comes with us in this conversation, and most of British Columbia, do a little sweep around the south and that island, and that's the only part that doesn't believe in the energy industry. The rest does. I work with Aboriginal people across the West. We are all supportive of the energy industry. The Liberal Party isn't.
Whenever the Liberals and NDP talk about whether it was phasing out the oil sands, to use Justin Trudeau's term from a few years ago, or some of the proposals more recently, they always talk about this magical transition that any oil and gas worker who loses their job will be picked up, doing something in the green sector. The government is prepared to put billions into green technology and green energy, but there doesn't seem to be a trust or an interest in people in the West to go along with that.
Well, one of my core businesses is producing electricity. We produce electricity from a gas-fired generator. We are expanding that using heat recovery. Heat recovery is the most efficient form of power production in the world. Nothing touches it. Heat recovery. It's waste heat. It was going into the air. It doesn't matter what's in the air. It's heat recovery. The federal government wouldn't talk to us about infrastructure support in any way, shape, or form. So that's number one. So I do know what I'm talking about when it comes to electricity generation. Do I believe in solar? Do I believe in wind? Yeah, I'm invested in both of those. But they can only work when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. And when the sun don't shine and the wind don't blow, you have nothing. And the idea that batteries are going to be ready for us, nobody dares to look at the full life cycle of the cost, carbon cost, human cost, the impact on people, the impact on the environment of producing batteries, lithium, all the other things that have to be, the rare earths that have to be produced. Nobody has the foresight to be able to show us how the economics can work. And so if they simply want to subsidize it and pretend that we're not going to have power at night or on cold, non-windy days, we're in trouble. So we absolutely have to have either nuclear or natural gas. Those are the two primary sources. We can expand water, but let's not forget for a moment that hydro backs up and destroys land. It takes away land from people in some way, shape, or form. So there's a cost to hydro that's not talked about either. Again, natural gas and nuclear are the solution, not this potential green revolution. Do I believe in solar and wind to be part of our energy grid? Absolutely. But they're not base. And we need base if we want the lights on. For a moment, look at Ida. Hurricane Ida shut down Louisiana for a month in terms of its power grid. How do you think the electricity will be supplied to the Teslas? And if we had, for example, fire trucks that were running off of batteries and there's no electricity, what do we do? And that's for a month. There isn't a charging station in Louisiana that's working. So nobody's talking about that. And how many people want to sit in an electric car when they're driving through a flood? Probably zero. Your hair will be standing on end because you don't know. You just don't know. And that's where the natural gas, or I call it, people keep calling it fossil fuels because they want to criticize it. It's like the tar sands, but they are the oil sands. The oil sands are the largest oil spill in the world. By taking sand and separating it from the oil, we're cleaning up the largest oil spill in the world. That's one of the ways of looking at the oil sands. And then I always call it hydrocarbons. These are hydrocarbons that we're working with. And we generate paint, we generate all sorts of products that are necessary for living day to day. So this transition gets us nowhere.
Beyond oil and gas, I know obviously this is a big part of the work that you do, but you're also in numerous other areas of business here. What would a Trudeau re-election mean for Canadian business by and large? Because to go back to where we started, business does adapt and they do navigate their way around red tape and burdens and regulations and fees and all that. But are we at a critical crossroads here for business in general in Canada?
Well, there's confusion at every level within the federal government in terms of the Liberals and even the NDP when they talk about taxing. The Liberal talk of taxing residences. Well, who's ever tracked the true cost of their residence when you renovate? So there's a cost base that hasn't been calculated or thought about. How do you value companies every year that the NDP doesn't think about? And as long as the NDP and the Liberals are influencing thought processes relative to how does a business operate, we're in trouble. Now, is the Conservative the only answer? No, I'm not going to argue that. Lots of good ideas. But the frustration out of being in a Liberal-driven government is you're waiting on subsidies, you're waiting on ESG, which isn't always the smartest way to run a business. Should we be responsible environmentally? I happen to think that population and pollution are the two issues on our planet. And how do we deal with pollution? Well, we don't stop producing it. It's how we recycle it. There's going to be garbage, but it's how we recover it. 90% of the plastic in the world's oceans comes from Southeast Asia, and yet Canada's trying to stop. And we could recycle our plastics, single-use plastics, which are used in medicine, used in groceries. And no, we're going to take plastic straws out of the industry and say that we're ahead of the curve. That's pure fallacy. It's hypocrisy. And that's why, as long as the Liberals are trying to run the government of the day and influence businesses of the day, we're in trouble.
Yeah, and the plastics ban is a particularly interesting one because all of a sudden when the pandemic hit and sanitation was the big question, no one was talking about banning single-use plastics again. And now it's creeping back into the political discourse now that we're starting to move beyond that. But single-use plastics were arguably the greatest benefit to most industry during the pandemic.
Well, and I emphasize the issue is dealing with the garbage, not producing it. And again, medical and groceries, there's single-use plastics everywhere, and it's all in how we capture them.
And they're not ending up in the oceans.
No, the Canadian ones are not ending up in the oceans. Is the water floating with pipe or plastic in it? Yeah, for sure. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But again, 90%. You can see videos online in Indonesia of people backing up garbage trucks and simply dumping it off the edge into the ocean because they don't have any place for it. They're an island. Well, where else would it go except the ocean? Well, it shows up for us, and yet nobody stops to think about that. So my pitch is we need to emphasize the recycling and capture of waste. And again, organics can be processed one way, paper another. But as we all know, it's common practice that all the recycling bins get dumped into one box, then they go to the garbage fill. So we're not truly recycling. So I'm not worried about waste in the oceans. I'm worried about how we properly recycle. And that means we do produce, we do make, we do use, but the recycling effort is what's necessary.
To go back to, for a moment, the divide between the West and the rest of Canada, you've traveled a lot. You know people in all parts of the country. You've probably met many people that have that same antipathy towards the West and Western industries that we see in government. Do you think it's possible to rectify that? Do people understand when you talk to them about the effect of these industries? Do they listen to these points that you're making, or do people really just dig their heels in and say, you know what, we need to move beyond oil and gas?
At the end of June, I was in Montreal for health reasons, just a checkup, and I met with 4 different groups of people, had 2 lunches, 2 dinners. Not once was there an acknowledgement that Energy East was a good idea. They didn't know. They didn't know that they were taking a third of our country's oil from Saudi Arabia and other nations like that. They didn't know. They didn't know Energy East was an option. And that's 4 couples, business people, business leaders, people who are active in the community, no knowledge. So what that means is that there's no press coverage, and there's certainly no political coverage. And as long as what political coverage there is, or media coverage is anti, we're going to shut down the oil and gas industry. We're going to shut down, waste, single-use plastics. Everything is negative. There's not one conversation about how do we make Canada better. Number one, we should be self-sufficient in energy. There's just no debate in that, because every dollar, the profit that goes into the oil that we buy from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, other places, is dollars that we could be using here that goes into hospitals and roads and whatever else. But we're buying $1 billion+ of oil a day from people who don't care about us in any way, shape, or form. And yet we could be producing our own oil. We have the economics, we have the infrastructure, we have the people, we have the knowledge, we have the capital, as I said, we have the economics are there. We could be doing it. But no, we got a couple people down east who say, we don't want no pipelines. And yet they're willing to take oil shipped down the St. Lawrence River and dropped off. I've heard rumors that the longshoremen in Quebec, maybe mafia influenced, who knows, but they play a big role in the anti-pipeline movement because they don't want to lose the pipeline coming, or the oil coming in down the seaway that they take into their ports. So there's a huge underground that says, no, we don't want that pipeline. Which is why sometimes I joke about, well, let's take a pipeline to the end of whatever lake Toronto's on, the big of the Great Lakes, and then ship the oil up the Great Lakes. People go, oh, no, we're not shipping oil up the Great Lakes. Well, it's fine to come down the St. Lawrence, but it's not okay to go up the Great Lakes. And again, that's the hypocrisy of ignorance. And that goes to your very point, is how do we educate? How do we engage? And that's why under a Liberal government, under an NDP government, again, if it was influenced by the Green Party, we would turn the faucets off for the oil and gas industry tomorrow and then wonder why the rest of the world is thriving and we're not.
Thank you for your candor.
Appreciate it.
As you can hear in that, it's not exactly a great picture for the West right now, and it seems like there's a bit of resilience that naturally comes, and I kind of touched on this in a couple of my questions, of businesses being able to adapt, but at a certain point you can't adapt your way out of this full-on assault from government, which is in a lot of cases how the Liberal government's record on the oil and gas sector has been, and you just can't take the oil and gas sector out of Alberta. And this is one of the big problems. There's a lot of conversation that you'll hear, not as much in the mainstream media because no one's covering it, but if you start paying closer attention, you will, called a just transition. And the whole nature of this, the premise of this concept is that we have to transition away from traditional energy sources, transition away from hydrocarbons. And the problem with this just transition is that there's nothing just about it. There's nothing to actually transition to. There's nothing to actually transition to. So for a lot of people, this is just going to be the death knell for their jobs and for their careers. And it's not just that, oh, well, we have to keep all jobs going at the expense of the environment. It's about recognizing that the oil and gas sector is doing a lot more efficiently to modernize and to be more environmentally friendly than any government regulation has to. But this has to happen organically. You can't just sign the death warrant for an industry, which is what so much of federal government policy has really been hell-bent on doing. And the idea of the oil and gas sector getting a middle finger from the government is not the only frustration that people in the West have, but it certainly is a significant one. And I think it underscores the problems because it's resources that make the West so wealthy. It's that wealth that allows Ottawa to just kind of go back and drill for cash. And then that happens in a way that just disproportionately shares that wealth with everyone else in the country without really giving anything but scorn back to the West. This is kind of the cycle of Western Canada's relationship with Confederation. And one of the reasons that so many people in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in parts of BC are saying the West wants out. Traditionally, it used to be that the West wanted a seat at the table. Now a lot of people and more people are saying we want independence. In October, there is a referendum on equalization. That is a stepping stone, a lot of people think, towards independence. The question comes down to whether an independence mindset can be pursued at the federal level, a la the Bloc Québécois. Jay Hill thinks it can. He is the interim leader of the Maverick Party. He's not actually seeking a seat, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the Maverick Party, which originally was called the Wexit Party, but changed its name, is seeking a number of kind of conservative proposals, but at its core, they want a better deal for the West, and if they can't get that, they want out. And with that, I want to welcome into the program the interim leader of the Maverick Party, Jay Hill. Jay, good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure, Andrew.
So let's first off talk about where the Maverick Party fits into this. I've spent a lot of time on the show talking about Western alienation, the growing Western independence movement. A lot of that has really been coming from people that want to make changes at the provincial level, whereas the Maverick Party is running candidates in a federal election. What's the goal here?
Well, as we explain on our website, Andrew, it's really a twin-track approach. We're trying to ensure that most Westerners would feel welcome in a federal home led by the Maverick Party as a partisan political movement. What we're suggesting is that Either we need to have a renewed arrangement with the rest of Canada that treats the West fairly under Confederation, and that's why we've proposed 5 constitutional amendments to accomplish that, or alternatively, we need to work towards greater autonomy and independence for Western Canada, and we have a plan for.
And just to make this clear for people, when you're talking about the West and Western Canada, you're not talking about Alberta specifically.
No, well, we're talking about all 4 Western provinces and indeed in the future, potentially the 3 Northern Territories. So basically everything west and north of the Hudson's Bay.
Explain why you think there can be a solution at a federal level here, because even if you were to have every seat west of Ontario, say, there still is going to be an Ontario and Quebec dominance in Parliament. So what could a slate of Western MPs, keeping in mind you're not running them in every Western riding, but what could even the full slate of Maverick candidates getting elected really do with those odds against you in the House of Commons?
Well, that's an excellent question, Andrew. And what we've suggested to Westerners is to look to Quebec and the example of the Bloc Québécois as an answer to that question. I would argue, having spent my entire 17 years in the House of Commons with Bloc members, that their strategy is very simple. They actually communicate it very forthrightly. They don't try to hide the fact that they are there strictly to represent Quebec and Quebec's best interests. So what I'm suggesting is that what we need in the House of Commons is a group of Western members of Parliament, very similar to the Bloc, that would be there only to represent Western interests. And that's what we're endeavoring to do with this first election. We're, as you say, we're barely a year old. So we're only running in 29 ridings where the Westerners in those ridings will have that option of supporting a Maverick candidate on Monday. And we'll see whether they participate in that alternative.
I just spent a couple of days covering Maxime Bernier's campaign for the People's Party in Alberta, and a lot of voters there were asking him, listen, I want to vote Maverick or PPC, how do I decide? And the message that he was giving them is that the Bloc Québécois has never really done anything for Quebec, only the Parti Québécois has. So he's basically trying to say that a federal party cannot get results for a province. What's your response to that?
Well, I think that's absolute nonsense. I think where we've failed in Western Canada ever since Confederation, and certainly for the last 100 years or so, Andrew, is that we've never done what Quebec has done in the sense of playing the independence card, if you will. Even today, Jason Kenney and other provincial politicians are reticent to do that. They're very reluctant. In fact, they say they don't even want to talk about independence. My view, having spent, as I say, 17 years of my life in the House of Commons trying to make things work in Parliament for the West, is that until we actually suggest that we're ready to leave, we're never going to get a fair deal. And that's the message we're carrying. And in the short term, Maverick members of Parliament operating similar to the Bloc would carry the message of true Western representation. I argue now that the Conservatives, the Liberals, the NDP, Greens, and even the PPC are not going to accurately represent the best interests of Westerners. So that's my argument to Max Bernier. I would suggest that Max should be refocusing these last few days on his own riding in Quebec if he's serious about re-entering Parliament and win that riding instead of being out here in Alberta telling Albertans how to vote.
As you mentioned, the Mavericks are only fielding 29 candidates here, so I don't think it's going to come as a shock to say that you aren't going to be forming a majority government come Monday or forming a government at all. But with that, it's also interesting to me that you as the interim leader are in an election campaign not seeking a seat yourself. You're not a permanent leader. You are an interim leader. What are voters to make of this, that you're a party that doesn't even really have a leader that's standing with their other candidates wanting to seek a seat?
Well, I would suggest they look at my personal history, Andrew. I've put in a big part of my adult lifetime in Parliament already. I guess if I was an ex-con, I'd say I've served my time. So, there's myself and three of my former Reform Party colleagues. Between us, we have over 60 years of parliamentary experience. The four of us are not seeking seats back in Parliament. As I say, we've served our time down in the House of Commons, and we're trying to mentor this new crop of candidates that have stepped forward to run for the Maverick Party. So it's a transition period. I would ask all voters looking at alternatives to look at our website at maverickparty.ca, look at our twin track mission statement, look at our 8 guiding principles and our policies and our platform, our constitution. Unlike the PPC, we actually have a party constitution. We have a governing council and their bios are all on there. This is not a one-man party like Maxime Bernier. And as you said, I quite proudly identify as the interim leader. It's my intention to try to help the party establish credibility. But from that point on, Andrew, we're looking to hand it over to the next generation of younger folks.
We know that during the Conservative Party of Canada leadership race, Aaron O'Toole was very much trying to align himself with the West, not pretend to be a Westerner, but he had Jason Kenney's endorsement. He did a lot of campaigning in Alberta. In the federal election campaign, and I've been following it fairly closely, I've not really heard Western interests brought up all that much at all. They didn't factor into the debates. There have been some Western adjacent topics in the context of pipelines, but there really hasn't been much oxygen given to Western interest, in my view. And I'm curious what your thoughts about that are.
Well, I would completely agree, Andrew. It's not only during the campaign, but I would argue ever since Aaron O'Toole won the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada, he has singularly focused on central Canada, on the needs of Toronto and surrounding area, and even more so on Quebec. And, why is Aaron O'Toole and all of his Western Conservative members of Parliament silent on how they would advocate people respond to Jason Kenney's equalization referendum next month? We haven't heard in that regard. I certainly know how Maverick feels, that we'll be urging everyone associated with Maverick Party to support that referendum question. In other words, vote yes. That should be removed from our constitution in Canada. It's unfair to the West. It's always been unfair, and it's even more so today with the struggles of our primary industries and Albertans in particular, but indeed people across the Prairie West. So there's a multitude of issues, from carbon tax, flip-flop, to his willingness to have a contract with Quebec to ensure that Quebecers get everything that they want, and yet no mention, as you say, Andrew, of what the West needs and indeed deserves. And that's where the Maverick Party comes in, and why we believe that only a Maverick member of Parliament will represent what is best for the West.
I know the Maverick Party does have a platform that deals in some specifics on things like the carbon tax and some of the pipeline bills and parliamentary ethics and all of these things. But generally speaking, I think you've summed up the party's overarching vision as being a voice for the West and advocating for Western interests. With that, I'm curious, is this a left-right issue, this idea of standing up for the West and having a Western focus in representation? Are you only getting votes from the political right, or is this something that cuts across traditional partisan lines?
Well, certainly the majority of our 29 ridings that we're contesting, Andrew, we're looking to draw the majority of our support from Conservatives. There's a reason, of course, why we chose to run in the strongest held Conservative ridings. It's because then it comes down to those Western Canadians having a choice between voting for the status quo, supporting in most cases their incumbent Conservative member of Parliament. They know exactly what they're going to get. They're going to get silence from them on a lot of issues because they run contrary to the best interests of Toronto or Montreal. Or they can vote for a Maverick candidate and get true Western representation, which is our core message, as you suggest. So that's the big difference between Maverick and the Conservatives. Having said that, we don't view ourselves as right, left, or center. We view ourselves very much as good old-fashioned Western common sense, which unfortunately is not all that common anymore.
So with that here, I mean, what's the dream scenario for you at the end of this? Is it that you want to just have a couple of Maverick MPs elected, or is there a particular outcome that you think is best for Western interests that Maverick MPs could then be advocates within?
Well, I think you've named it there, is that ideally we can elect some Maverick MPs. We recognize that is going to be very, very difficult. Party less than a year old, only running in 29 ridings, only recently getting organized, short on resources, both financial and human resources. We don't have the thousands of volunteers we'd love to have to carry the message, Andrew, across Western Canada. Having said that, we also recognize that this is a stepping stone. It is a building block for Maverick, very similar to what the Reform Party did in 1988 when myself and Bell Meredith first ran for the party. We stayed involved for the years in between. And then, of course, we wiped out the Progressive Conservatives in 93. Does history repeat itself? It could very clearly. To move to independence, we support the majority of the Fair Deal panel recommendations that panel made to the Alberta government. We believe that many of those recommendations could also work in Saskatchewan and the other two Western provinces. We recognize that's provincial purview, but we're very supportive of moving towards greater autonomy along the same lines that Quebec has achieved for itself.
Jay Hill, interim leader of the Maverick Party and former cabinet minister and longtime member of parliament at the federal level. Jay, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on today.
Thank you, Andrew. I always appreciate being on your show.
That was Jay Hill, leader of the Maverick Party, the interim leader. It's not exactly clear who's going to lead that party into the future. Jay is talking about this as though it is really the birth of a longer-term movement. When I was out west talking to people, now keep in mind, the Maverick Party didn't have a tour to follow, so when I was out there, I was at PPC events, but there were a few people that were actually asking about this, saying, hey, listen, Max, I like you, but I want to vote Maverick. And Maxime Bernier says that the Mavericks are not a real party. He was very, very clear that he doesn't see them as being all that legitimate. But the interesting thing is, for a lot of people, they're kind of this mindset that before anything else can happen, we need to have an independent West. Anything else is secondary. So the idea of, the carbon tax or this or that, no, they think that none of that is really going to happen unless they have an autonomous Western, not necessarily a state, but a more sovereign, more autonomous province. So then the question comes down to, is that more achievable at a provincial level or at a federal level? Because provincially, you have the Wild Rose Independence Party. We've spoken to its leader, Paul Hinman, on the show in the past. They don't tend to get along with the Mavericks, so far as I can tell. A lot of their voters probably overlap, but the actual parties have fairly different visions. And this is what I've talked about how a lot of the time the alt movements, the opposition movements are so fractured that it kind of tends to undercut any chance of success. So that's one of the big problems to be on guard for in these sorts of things. But the whole point of the Maverick Party is not to spoil. They say, and they're very clear about this, that they want the Conservative Party of Canada to win, and they want a few Maverick MPs within that to set the agenda, whereas the PPC just completely does not want Conservatives, thinks Aaron O'Toole is no different than Justin Trudeau, and is completely happy, it sounds like, spoiling it so that Justin Trudeau gets in again, if that is where the numbers go. And the PPC, this is why a lot of people are rubbed the wrong way by them, because the PPC thinks that they're all the same. And I would say most voters, even if they don't love Aaron O'Toole, would have a hard time saying if it's one or the other that they'd prefer Justin Trudeau. This is my own speculation, but even a lot of PPC voters I've spoken to, they may have no love lost for the Conservatives, but when push comes to shove, if you say you get to choose, you get 4 years of Justin Trudeau or 4 years of Aaron O'Toole, I bet the majority would say, okay, fine, I'd take Aaron O'Toole. But it's very personal for Bernier, and you can tell that when the way he talks about the Conservatives, the way he goes after them relentlessly, whereas the Mavericks are saying, yeah, we realize the Conservative Party is going to be better for the West. We want to work within that, but we'd have some demands. And I talked about this a little bit with Tarek Elnaga. Now, I had Tarek on the show once before, and he told me, if you're ever around the area, come on out to the ranch. So when I was out there doing interviews, I did exactly that. Now, Tarek Elnaga is one of the candidates in Banff Airdrie, a riding about which you've heard me speak a couple of times now. We spoke to their PPC candidate, Nadine Wellwood. They've got the Conservative incumbent, Blake Richards, who, again, I emailed multiple times trying to ask for an interview and did not get a single response. They've got an independent, Derek Sloan. They've got a hardcore separatist independent by the name of Ron Voss. Plus, they've got the Liberal NDP, Greens, and all that. 9 candidates total. So I watched actually last night an all-candidates debate hosted by the Airdrie Chamber of Commerce, and the opening statements lasted, I think, like the first 30 minutes. So it's quite an exciting riding if you're following it, one I'm going to be watching on election night. But Tarek said, come on out to the ranch, so I did exactly that, and he arrived on horseback, which I've never had happen to any interview I've done before, where I've just been waiting and then a horse rolls up. But he did that, the only candidate to whom I could say, get off your high horse, although I absolutely didn't. It would have backfired because at the end of the interview, he made me get up on my own high horse, as you can see in that photo there. Had a grand old time, but we chatted about politics. It wasn't just about horse riding, although we did, the horses were always nearby. But I wanted to talk to Tarek about how the campaign's going and also how that Maverick vision fits in with what Canada's going through right now. This is our conversation. I know one of the criticisms of the Maverick Party's approach has been that if you want to look at Quebec as being the poster child for advancing a provincial agenda, Quebec's success has mostly come from having a strong provincial party looking out for Quebec issues. People have said the Bloc Québécois hasn't really done that much for Quebec and Ottawa. What's your read on that? Because the Maverick Party is obviously seeking seats in Parliament in Ottawa. Can you advance a provincial agenda through federal politics?
I think you need both, Andrew. I think what you do is you need both. You need a federal party that backs provincial requirements that need federal intervention. So things like equalization being an easy example of that. So when I look at the Bloc Québécois, for example, Yves Blanchette over the last few days has been on fire and has essentially trolled the other leaders and said, "Hey, I only care about Quebec." Now, what we want is someone that at the federal level, because we have a lot of our industries that are federally regulated. So I think of oil and gas being one, especially pipeline transmissions, and the second one being aviation. So these are two big industries in the riding here. I don't want Ottawa managing these. I'd rather they be managed in Western Canada, because Ottawa is mismanaged, or if anything, has worked on shutting down our industries.
You mentioned the lack of a Western discussion at the debates, both English and French. Obviously, the French debate probably not going to focus as much on the West. But let me ask you, what are the issues that you think are distinctly Western that need to be addressed? Because a lot of the things that Albertans and people in the West are facing are issues that everyone in Canada is facing, whether it's affordability, taxes, government accountability. Why do you think the West needs to be addressed separately from that?
So there's a number of issues that are uniquely Western, and I'll think of our energy sector as one. So our energy sector provides the prosperity really for the rest of Canada. And we look at it and we said, as now we have a government that is comfortable buying foreign oil, $60 million a day worth of it from places like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, but refusing to buy or develop our own resources. This has never been a question of green energy versus oil. So that's one. Two, when it comes to things like taxation, equalization, etc., what we want is the government to get out of the way. So we don't want subsidies. We don't want handouts. The Western way of life is to earn it, and the Western way of life is to work hard. And right now what we have is the government in the way of aviation, in the way of agriculture, in the way of oil and gas, and in the way of tourism. Those are the 4 biggest industries we've got here in the riding. And I'd like to see the government get out of the way, because right now, if you look at, you go buy a plane ticket, look at what your fare is compared to all your taxes and fees, right? And that over-regulation, that over-taxation is what we want. So our issues are pretty unique here. The other thing is we continue to see our economy get battered, even though right now economic conditions are favorable. The price of oil is really good, right? But companies are reluctant to develop pipeline and to develop rigs when the government's in the way, and they're saying, well, what will the permitting process look like, right?
For a lot of federal politicians especially, and arguably provincial politicians elsewhere, oil and gas pipelines are very abstract ideological issues. You have NDP politicians that are very anti-oil and pipelines. You've got Quebecers that oftentimes, even a conservative government in Quebec that's very much against pipelines, against Canadian oil and gas sector. Here it's not ideological. It's the livelihood of a lot of people. It's the lifeblood of the province. Even the politicians that talk about transitioning and getting people new jobs who are displaced because of anti-oil policies, does any of that actually materialize to something that on the ground people in the oil and gas sector in the West think that they would actually get?
It doesn't. That's a great question. It doesn't. I mean, go around and ask where are all the green jobs around here. And, transition isn't a bad thing, but I look at it and I say nobody regulated the VHS out of existence. Something better came along. Right? And something better, quicker, faster. What we're doing is we're taxing the life out of our industry in favor of buying foreign oil. So here, it isn't an ideological thing. It is what pays for mortgages. It is what puts food on the table. And it is also what drives all of the services around the economy. So people think it's just oil and gas, but it drives hotels, it drives restaurants, it drives transportation, it drives a whole bunch of other industries. It's a key economic driver. And to think that oil consumption in the world and oil demand right now is going up, but we're intent on shutting down a very ethical, very responsible, very human rights forward industry here in the West blows my mind. And I think also the carbon tax is a big one. So it doesn't just affect oil and gas, but affects everything. It's a tax on everything. And I look at, to your point, the Conservatives, even out east, have somehow convinced themselves that a tax is going to save the planet. I think it's incredibly naive to think that, that's going to save a planet, and you're going to punish Canadians for heating their homes or driving their vehicles when you don't have a choice. It's not a discretionary choice here whether you can or can't heat your home.
We had a mini controversy earlier on in the election about the politics of pickup trucks. And I think you and I talked about this in our previous interview. One of the first things you did when you moved here was buy a pickup truck. These sorts of things are kind of amusing when you've got, people on the left and people in the media saying no one should be able to have pickup trucks. But they do reveal, I think, a very genuine disconnect between the Western way of life and the rest of Canada. And I'm curious if you think that divide can be bridged.
Right. This is the beauty. It's a great question. This is the beauty of why I'm running for the Maverick Party, is we don't have a divide to bridge. We only look out for the West. We have tried relying on the Conservative Party. This is the base of the Conservative Party. And we've tried relying on the Conservative Party to really relay our way of life, our industries, the way we live. And we found not only have they failed at that, but they've also not really stood up in defending us. So yes, people out in the cities in the East think that, we drive pickup trucks because we're bold and bad and all that. Well, how am I going to move these guys? And I need a pickup truck as a tool for my way of life and work and all of that. So I look at it and I say, it isn't feasible for me to be driving around a Prius or a Tesla for my way of life. Now, here's the difference between us and the Conservative parties. The Conservative parties is now trying to appease a voter in Toronto and Quebec that they've completely forgotten about their base. The base that lives like this, and the base that lives in Saskatchewan and Alberta and the prairies in BC. And we've said, you know what, we have to look after our own now. And if the divide wants to exist, and I'll give you another example of that, Andrew, if Toronto want to ban all their guns, we're not gonna argue with it anymore. But what we want is a regional firearms officer that builds our own firearms laws, because we need them. It's a tool of our trade, whether we're ranchers, sport shooters, hunters, etc. It's part of the lifestyle that we live here. So I look at it and I say the divide exists. For as long as I've known, we've tried educating Eastern Canada on how ethical and cleaner oil is, and how human rights forward it is. We've tried telling them about our lifestyle, and it just seems like it doesn't work. So I'll say, you know what, if the divide exists, let it exist, and let's focus on the West.
So at the risk of putting words in your mouth, you're not interested in winning over Zoe in downtown Toronto or Jean-Pierre in Montreal. You just want to be left alone.
Exactly. And we want the governments out of the way, Andrew. And the thing is, that's the beauty of our party, is we don't have a single voter to appease or pander to in Quebec and Ontario, just like Aaron O'Toole is, because, you know, you look at it's simple numbers. 231 seats are east of Manitoba, and 107 of them are Manitoba West. So that you're always going to have the government being set depending on what Eastern Canada votes. And forget, you know, you always hear it, by the time we vote in Alberta. Well, by the time we vote in Manitoba, the government's typically decided. So relying on Eastern Canada to vote one way or another isn't a winning strategy. We need to start voting now on Western issues and saying we want a Western voice. I put out a tweet this morning. I'm like, can you imagine if the West had a Blanchette type in the debates that said Western Canada, Western Canada, Western Canada all the time? Right now, we don't. And I'd like to see that, I mean, I hate saying it, but I'd like to see someone speak exclusively for Western Canada and start to push forward, and this is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to push forward constitutional amendments that bring fairness and equity back to Western Canada.
So I guess on that note, let's say Mavericks do elect 2 or 3 members of parliament on September 20th. How much power can they really have if they are dominated by, as you've mentioned there, an Eastern House of Commons?
Right. So I'll give you examples of power. So we're running 30 candidates, and just before the election was called, if I'm not mistaken, the Bloc Québécois have 32 candidates in the House. That's equal. And that's just our first start here. As we continue to grow that movement, 107 ridings in Western Canada, Quebec has 78 seats. So think about that in terms of a voting bloc over time as we grow. And I'll give you the easiest example. The Green Party has what? 2 seats now, or two or three seats. Look at the amount of voice, press, ink that they get for 2 or 3 seats. Or I'll use the easiest example, Jody Wilson-Raybould pushing Bill C-96 back into debate as one independent MP. Look at the power she had in the House to bring attention to that issue. So it is possible, and you know, I'd love to see all 30 Maverick candidates go to Ottawa, because it would be the absolute best thing for the West. Now, there is an issue in people's minds here in the West of do we split the vote, etc. Despite the fact that they're very disappointed with Aaron O'Toole representing no Western issues, flip-flopping on gun control, flip-flopping on the carbon tax, continuing to appease Quebec for everything that it wants, is the best outcome for Western Canada for this immediate election here in just over 10 days is to see a Aaron O'Toole government that gets supported by a Maverick Party. Will never form a formal coalition, but you say, if you want our support, then these are a list of demands, including things like scrapping the carbon tax and building an energy corridor. So how powerful would it be if it's the Mavericks that get Aaron O'Toole over the finish line and say, you want our support, this is what we want?
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
That was Maverick candidate in Banff Airdrie, Tarek Elnaga, joining me, or actually I was joining him, I guess. But in any case, that was our conversation from a few days back. As I said, this is not an endorsement. I'm not telling you to vote Maverick, Conservative, PPC, Liberal, NDP, Green, Communist, Marxist, Leninist, and don't you dare mix those up. The Communists and the Marxist, Leninists don't exactly get along for reasons that it would actually be quite fun to explore. Maybe I should do like the old Lincoln-Douglas debate, but with just a communist on one side and a Marxist-Leninist on the other side. In any case, I'm just putting this out there because I want you to know what the themes are on the ground. And also, I want you to know with these movements, it's easy for people in Ontario, Quebec, even BC to say, yeah, you know, it's conservative or bust, which for the most part it is in a lot of these ridings. But if something strange happens on election night, I would not be surprised to see it happening in Alberta. You just have too many different parts of the coalition, too many moving pieces here to ignore, that it's certainly going to be worth paying attention to. I'm going to be. And with that, I want to plug, True North is going to be doing an election night show. We'll have the details in the coming days, and I know my colleague Candace Malcolm, who's been doing more of the news of the day updates for you on her daily show, will have some details about that. And I should tell you, one of the reasons that I enjoy being able to delve into some of these lesser covered stories is because I know that the True North team is getting all the top line, big headlines out through Canada's show and on our website, tnc.news. So gives me the freedom to have a little bit of fun with this. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, whether you're from the West or not. I hope you learned something from this episode. We will talk to you soon with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. Thank you, God bless, and good day.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.